Sandra jolted awake to the sound of a loud voice calling her name. Her head throbbed, her body ached, and an inexplicable sense of dread consumed her. Slowly, she became aware of her surroundings. Her confusion deepened as she felt the soreness in her body and realized she wasn't wearing any clothes. Panic set in when her eyes landed on the figure of a man lying next to her on the bed. Her heart sank when she recognized him. It was Paulo, her sister Charmaine's fiancé. A crimson stain on the sheets beside Paulo told her everything she didn't want to believe. The implications of what had happened overwhelmed her. Sandra froze in place, unable to comprehend how things had spiraled out of control. Before she could collect herself, the door to her room burst open. Her parents, Divina and Delphin, stood there, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. "God forbid," Divina exclaimed, her voice trembling as her hand flew to her chest. Delphin's jaw clenched, and his fists tightened at his sides. "Sandra, what does this mean? Who is this man?" Delphin demanded, his voice sharp with fury. Sandra shook her head, unable to find the words to explain the inexplicable. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to recall the events of the previous night, but her memory was a blank slate. "Answer me, Sandra. Why aren't you saying anything?" Delphin roared. Before Sandra could muster a response, Charmaine's voice cut through the tense silence. "Mom, Dad, why don't you just make the man take responsibility for Sandra?" she said, stepping into the room. Her tone was sharp and accusatory. Charmaine's gaze shifted to Sandra, and her expression darkened. "And you, Sandra, how could you? You already have a boyfriend, and yet you never told us about this affair." Sandra's heart broke at the venom in her sister's words. She wanted to deny the accusations, to explain that she didn't know how Paulo had ended up in her bed, but her voice failed her. Paulo stirred, groaning as he woke up. His eyes widened in shock as he realized where he was and what state he was in. "No, this can't be happening," he muttered, running a hand over his face as if trying to erase the memory of the night before. "Paulo!" Divina's voice rang out, filled with anger and disbelief. Paulo sat up, looking horrified as his gaze darted between Sandra and Charmaine. "Brother Pau," Sandra began, but her words were cut off as Charmaine lunged at her, delivering a stinging slap across her face. "You shameless woman! You've ruined everything!" Charmaine screamed, tears streaming down her face as she slapped Sandra repeatedly. "How could you do this to me?" Sandra cried out, "Sister, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Don't call me your sister. You're no sister of mine," Charmaine shouted, her voice breaking with heartbreak and rage. Divina stepped forward, her anger directed at Sandra. "You're a disgrace. You're just like your father, a cheat and a liar." Sandra flinched at her mother's harsh words, the weight of her condemnation cutting deep. Delphin intervened, pulling Charmaine away from Sandra. "Enough, Charmaine. There's nothing we can do to change what's happened," Delphin said, trying to restore order, but his words only seemed to ignite Divina's fury further. "Nothing we can do? Are you serious, Delphin? This is your fault. She's inherited your unfaithful nature." Divina spat, her voice trembling with rage. Sandra's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother's harsh words and her sister's betrayal accusations echoed in her mind. She felt like her world had crumbled, and there was no way to piece it back together. The fallout from the scandal sent shockwaves through the household. Sandra became a pariah in her own family. Divina's disdain for her deepened, and Charmaine refused to speak to her. Delphin, torn between his wife and daughter, struggled to maintain peace in a house consumed by tension. Sandra tried to reach out to Charmaine, desperate to explain that she had no memory of what had happened with Paulo. "Sister, please listen to me. I don't know how this happened. I swear I didn't mean to hurt you," Sandra pleaded. But Charmaine's heart had hardened. "Save your lies, Sandra. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. You're dead to me," she replied coldly before walking away. Paulo, too, was drowning in guilt. He couldn't bring himself to face Charmaine or her family, and his attempts to reach Sandra only made things worse. Sandra avoided him at every turn, unable to bear the weight of his shame and her own. Divina's anger towards Sandra wasn't just about the scandal. It was rooted in a deeper pain. Years ago, Delphin had cheated on her, and Sandra was the result of that affair. The truth, long buried, now threatened to tear the family apart. One evening, Sandra overheard her parents arguing in the living room. "You've always been too lenient with her, Delphin. She's just like you, weak-willed and unfaithful," Divina shouted. "Don't bring up the past, Divina. Sandra is innocent in this. She doesn't deserve to be treated like this," Delphin argued, his voice filled with frustration. "Innocent? She seduced her sister's fiancé. She's a disgrace to this family," Divina countered, her voice breaking with emotion. Sandra's heart sank as she listened to the exchange. The weight of her mother's disdain and her father's guilt was unbearable. She felt like an outsider in her own home, unloved and unwanted. The only person who seemed to believe in her innocence was Delphin. He tried to shield her from Divina's wrath and Charmaine's anger, but his efforts often backfired, only deepening the divide within the family. Meanwhile, Paulo struggled to reconcile his actions with his conscience. He began piecing together fragments of the night, suspecting that someone might have drugged them, but proving it would be difficult, and the damage had already been done. Sandra, feeling lost and alone, began to question her own worth. She longed for a chance to start over, to escape the suffocating environment of her home. But the path to redemption and healing seemed impossible. Days turned into weeks, yet the storm of betrayal that had engulfed Sandra's family refused to settle. Sandra found herself increasingly isolated, a silent observer to the growing chasm between her loved ones. Charmaine avoided her at all costs, and her mother, Divina, made no effort to hide her disdain. One evening, Sandra mustered the courage to approach Charmaine. She found her sister in the garden, sitting on a bench and staring at the roses their father had planted years ago. "Sister," Sandra said hesitantly, her voice trembling. Charmaine turned, her eyes cold and distant. "Don't call me that." Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes, but she pressed on. "Please, believe me. I don't know what happened that night. I swear I didn't mean to hurt you." Charmaine's jaw clenched, and her voice was laced with venom. "How convenient for you to not remember. You ruined my life, Sandra. My wedding is canceled and my fiancé, Paulo, can't even look me in the eye anymore. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Sandra whispered. "I don't even understand how." "Enough." Charmaine stood abruptly, her voice rising. "You've taken everything from me. You disgust me, Sandra. Stay away from me. I don't have a sister anymore." Sandra watched helplessly as Charmaine walked away, her heart breaking anew. She felt the weight of her sister's hatred pressing down on her, suffocating her. While Sandra battled her guilt and shame, Paulo was wrestling with his own demons. He had spent countless sleepless nights replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He remembered going to the party, having a few drinks, and then nothing. His memory was a blank until he woke up in Sandra's bed. Desperate for answers, Paulo decided to confront Sandra. He found her sitting by the riverbank behind her family's house, a place she often retreated to when she needed solace. "Sandra," he called out softly. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Paulo, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, sitting down beside her. Sandra stiffened, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. "What's there to talk about? Haven't we done enough damage already?" Paulo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sandra, I don't think what happened that night was natural." "What do you mean?" she asked, her brows furrowing. "I mean, I don't remember anything. I don't remember how I got to your room or why I was there. It's like my mind just blacked out." Sandra looked at him, her heart pounding. "You think someone did this to us?" "It's possible," Paulo said, his voice heavy, "but I don't have any proof. All I know is that I would never intentionally hurt Charmaine, and I don't think you would either." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "I wouldn't, Paulo. I would never do that to her." Paulo reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Sandra. We owe it to Charmaine, and to ourselves, to find the truth." Meanwhile, Divina's simmering anger towards Sandra had begun to manifest in cruel ways. She assigned Sandra the most grueling household chores and criticized her at every opportunity. Delphin tried to intervene, but his efforts only seemed to fan the flames of Divina's wrath. "Why do you always defend her?" Divina snapped one evening as Delphin tried to advocate for Sandra. "She's a disgrace to this family." "She's our daughter, Divina," Delphin replied, his voice firm, "and I won't stand by and watch you tear her down." Divina scoffed. "Your daughter, maybe. Sometimes I wonder if she even deserves to call me her mother." Unbeknownst to them, Sandra had overheard their argument. Her heart ached as she listened to her mother's cruel words. She felt like a stranger in her own home, unwanted and unloved. Later that night, as Sandra lay in bed, she found herself replaying Paulo's words in her mind. Could someone have orchestrated the events of that night? If so, who would have had the motive to ruin her life and Charmaine's? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Delphin standing there, a worried look on his face. "Sandra, can we talk?" he asked gently. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "I know things have been difficult for you," Delphin began, sitting down on the edge of her bed, "but I need you to know that I believe you. I don't think you would ever hurt Charmaine intentionally." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot to me." Delphin hesitated before continuing. "There's something I need to tell you. It's about your mother and me." Sandra's heart raced as she braced herself for whatever revelation was about to come. "Years ago, before you were born, I made a mistake," Delphin admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I had an affair. Your mother found out, and it nearly destroyed our marriage. She stayed with me, but she's never truly forgiven me. And now, with what's happened, I think it's brought all that pain back for her." Sandra stared at him, stunned. "Are you saying Mom's anger toward me isn't just about what happened with Paulo?" Delphin nodded. "She sees me in you, Sandra. My mistakes, my failures. But that doesn't make her right to treat you the way she has." Sandra felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. At least now she understood why her mother seemed to harbor such deep resentment toward her. As Delphin left her room, Sandra made a silent vow to uncover the truth about what had happened that night. She couldn't change the past, but she could fight for her future and for her family's redemption. The tension in the household grew unbearable. Sandra, ostracized and weighed down by guilt, carried her pain in silence. Divina's sharp words echoed daily, while Charmaine's cold, disdainful gaze pierced her heart. The household no longer felt like a home. It had become a battlefield, and Sandra was losing the fight. One afternoon, Sandra found Charmaine in the dining room, sifting through wedding invitations she hadn't yet had the heart to discard. Sandra hesitated at the doorway before mustering the courage to speak. "Charmaine, I just want to talk," Sandra began tentatively. Charmaine's hands froze mid-motion, but she didn't look up. "What could you possibly have to say that I'd want to hear?" Sandra's throat tightened. "I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything. For what happened and for the pain I caused you." Charmaine finally raised her eyes, her expression icy. "Sorry? Do you think an apology can fix this? You ruined my life, Sandra. You destroyed my future with Paulo." Sandra's tears threatened to spill, but she fought them back. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Paulo and we don't even know how it happened. We think someone might have." Charmaine slammed her hands on the table, silencing her. "Don't you dare try to twist this into something it's not. I trusted you, Sandra. You were my sister, and you betrayed me in the worst way possible." Sandra's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please, Charmaine, I need you to believe me. I would never. Get out, Charmaine interrupted, her voice trembling with fury. I don't want to hear another word from you. Heartbroken, Sandra retreated to her room. She felt the walls closing in, suffocating her with the weight of her sister's hatred and the fractured bonds that once held their family together. Paulo, consumed by guilt and confusion, began digging into the events of that fateful night. He retraced his steps, starting with the party he had attended before waking up in Sandra's bed. Something didn't add up, and he was determined to uncover the truth. He sought out friends who had been at the party, questioning them about the drinks, the atmosphere, and any unusual occurrences. One of his friends, James, hesitated before speaking. Paulo, there's something you should know, James began cautiously. I saw someone slip something into your drink that night. Paulo's eyes widened. What? Who? I didn't see their face clearly, but it wasn't someone I recognized. They left the party not long after you did, James admitted. Paulo's mind raced. If someone had drugged him, it explained the memory loss and the inexplicable events that followed. But who would go to such lengths to ruin his life? And why? Determined to get answers, Paulo decided to confront Sandra. He found her sitting by the riverbank again, her usual spot for solitude. Sandra, Paulo called, approaching her. She looked up, startled. Paulo? What is it? I think someone set us up, he said bluntly, sitting beside her. Sandra's eyes widened. What do you mean? I've been asking. Around about that night, Paulo explained, one of my friends saw someone tampering with my drink. I think we were drugged, Sandra. Sandra's heart pounded. But who would do that? And why? I don't know yet, Paulo admitted, his expression grim, but I'm not going to stop until I find out. Sandra felt a flicker of hope. If Paulo was right, then maybe, just maybe, she could clear her name and repair her relationship with her family. While Paulo and Sandra worked together to uncover the truth, Divina grew increasingly bitter and resentful. Her anger wasn't just about the betrayal she believed Sandra had committed. It was also rooted in wounds from her past. One evening, as Sandra walked past her parents' bedroom, she overheard an argument between Divina and Delphin. Why do you keep defending her? Divina snapped. She's just like you, a liar and a cheat. Divina, that's enough, Delphin said firmly. Sandra is our daughter. She doesn't deserve to be treated like this. Divina laughed bitterly. Our daughter? Sometimes I wonder if she's even mine. She reminds me so much of the women you betrayed me with. Sandra's heart sank. Her mother's words were like a dagger to her chest. She had always suspected there was more to her mother's anger, but hearing it spoken aloud confirmed her worst fears. The next morning, Sandra confronted her father. Dad, is what Mom said true? Is her anger toward me because of what you did? Delphin hesitated, his face etched with guilt. Sandra, your mother has been through a lot. My mistakes hurt her deeply, and she's never fully healed from them. But why does she take it out on me? Sandra asked, her voice breaking. Delphin placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's not fair, Sandra, and it's not your fault. But sometimes, people project their pain onto others, even when they don't mean to. Sandra nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She resolved to not only uncover the truth about what had happened with Paulo, but also to find a way to heal the wounds within her family. Later that day, Paulo showed up at the house with a new lead. Sandra, I think I know who might be behind this, he said urgently. Sandra's eyes widened. Who? Paulo hesitated before replying. Charmaine's best friend, Lila. I overheard her talking to someone at the party that night, and it sounded suspicious. Sandra felt a surge of anger. Could Lila have been the one to sabotage her and Paulo? If so, what was her motive? As Sandra and Paulo pieced together the puzzle, they realized they were getting closer to the truth. But with each step forward, they also uncovered deeper secrets and betrayals that threatened to tear their world apart even further. Determined to follow Paulo's lead, Sandra and Paulo discreetly observed Lila, Charmaine's closest friend. Lila had always been around the family, radiating charm and earning everyone's trust. However, Paulo couldn't ignore the suspicious conversation he had overheard at the party. Sandra reluctantly agreed to meet Paulo at a nearby coffee shop to discuss their next steps. "Are you sure about this, Paulo?" Sandra asked, her voice hesitant. "Yes," Paulo replied, his jaw set. "I overheard Lila talking about making things messy that night. I need to know if she's involved." Sandra sighed. "Charmaine won't believe us, even if we find something. She trusts Lila more than anyone." "That's why we need proof," Paulo said firmly. Later that evening, Paulo visited Lila under the pretense of seeking advice. He brought up the events of the night in question, carefully gauging her reactions. "Lila," Paulo began casually, "do you remember much from the party?" Lila's eyes flickered with something Paulo couldn't quite place. "Not really," she said with a forced laugh. "Why?" "I just find it strange," Paulo continued, "how I can't remember anything after a certain point. And Sandra, well, she was out of it too." Lila froze for a moment before regaining her composure. "Maybe you two just drank too much," she said nonchalantly, but her voice wavered slightly. Paulo pressed on. "Maybe, but someone mentioned seeing you near the drinks table that night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Lila's demeanor shifted, her usual confidence replaced with unease. "Why are you asking me this, Paulo?" she asked defensively. "Because I think you know more than you're letting on," Paulo said bluntly. Lila's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Paulo left the conversation with more suspicion than answers, but he knew he was onto something. Sandra couldn't shake the feeling of dread as Paulo shared his encounter with Lila. "If she's involved, then why?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Paulo admitted, "but I think it has something to do with Charmaine." Sandra's heart sank. Could Lila's actions stem from jealousy or some twisted sense of loyalty to Charmaine? The next day, Sandra decided to confront Lila herself. She found her in Charmaine's room, helping her sister sort through wedding decorations that now seemed like relics of a shattered dream. "Lila, can we talk?" Sandra asked, her tone calm but firm. Lila looked up, her expression unreadable. "What do you want, Sandra?" "I want the truth," Sandra said, stepping closer. "About that night." Charmaine frowned. "What's going on?" "Stay out of this, Charmaine," Sandra said, her voice steady. "This is between me and Lila." Charmaine looked between them, confused and wary, but didn't interrupt. Lila crossed her arms. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Sandra said, her voice rising. "You were there, Lila. You tampered with Paulo's drink, didn't you?" Lila's eyes widened briefly before narrowing. "You don't have any proof," she hissed. Charmaine gasped. "Lila, what is she talking about?" Sandra's chest tightened as she saw the betrayal dawn on her sister's face. Lila tried to recover, but her composure was slipping. "Charmaine, don't listen to her," Lila said quickly. "She's just trying to turn you against me." But Charmaine was already looking at Lila with suspicion. "Lila, is it true?" Lila didn't answer, and the silence spoke volumes. Paulo arrived at the house just as the confrontation between Sandra, Charmaine, and Lila reached its peak. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping into the room. Sandra turned to him, her face pale but determined. "I think Lila has something to tell us." Lila glared at Sandra before turning to Charmaine. "Fine," she spat. "You want the truth?" "Yes, I spiked Paulo's drink that night, but I didn't mean for things to go this far." Charmaine's face crumpled in disbelief. "Why, Lila? Why would you do something like that?" Lila hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. Because I've been in love with Paulo for years. I couldn't stand watching you two together, so I thought if I created some distance, he'd come to me instead." Sandra felt a mix of anger and pity as Lila's confession hung in the air. "Do you realize what you've done?" Sandra said, her voice shaking. "You've ruined my relationship with my family, my sister. You've destroyed everything." Charmaine looked at Lila with disgust. You were my best friend. How could you betray me like this? Paulo stepped forward. Lila, you need to tell everyone the truth. Sandra and I didn't choose this. You manipulated the situation, and now we're all paying the price. Lila nodded reluctantly, her guilt finally consuming her. I'll tell the truth, she whispered. I'll tell everyone. After Lila's confession, Sandra and Paulo faced the next challenge, confronting the entire family with the truth. Tensions ran high as Sandra and Paulo sat in the living room, waiting for their parents and Charmaine to join them. Sandra's palms were sweaty, and her heart raced as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the air. Her father, Delphin, entered the room first, followed by her mother, Divina, who looked stern and skeptical. Charmaine trailed behind, her eyes red and puffy from crying. What's this about? Delphin asked, his tone sharp. Sandra glanced at Paulo, who gave her a reassuring nod. We need to talk about what really happened that night, Sandra began, her voice trembling. Divina scoffed. Is this another attempt to justify your betrayal, Sandra? No, Ma, Sandra said firmly. This is about the truth, the whole truth. Before anyone could interrupt, Paulo spoke. Lila confessed. She admitted to spiking my drink and manipulating the events of that night. Charmaine's face twisted in anger and heartbreak. She admitted it to me too, she said quietly. Lila was never my friend. She was jealous of me, of us. Delphin frowned deeply. Jealousy? And she went this far? Sandra nodded, her voice breaking. Yes, Papa. I didn't want this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially Charmaine. But Lila's actions put me and Paulo in this impossible situation. Divina looked unconvinced. And you expect us to believe this? That everything was Lila's fault? Paulo's jaw tightened. Mrs. Santos, I swear to you, Sandra and I were both victims in this. Neither of us would ever intentionally hurt Charmaine or this family. Charmaine, still reeling, spoke up. It's true, Mama. Lila's jealousy drove her to do this. She wanted Paulo for herself and thought destroying my relationship would make it happen. The room fell silent as Divina and Delphin absorbed the revelations. Finally, Delphin spoke. If this is true, then Lila must face the consequences of her actions. The family decided to summon Lila to confront her in person. When she arrived, her usual confident demeanor was replaced by visible guilt and apprehension. Sandra and Paulo told us everything, Delphin began, his voice cold. Is it true? Did you spike Paulo's drink and orchestrate this mess? Lila hesitated, her eyes darting to Charmaine, whose expression was a mix of anger and betrayal. Yes, Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I did it. Divina stood, her hands trembling with fury. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? To my daughters? I wasn't thinking clearly, Lila said, tears streaming down her face. I was consumed by jealousy. I never meant for things to get this far. Charmaine's voice was cold as ice. You didn't mean for things to get this far? You ruined my relationship, my trust, everything. How could you do this to me? Lila fell to her knees, sobbing. I'm so sorry, Charmaine. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'll do anything to make it right. Delphin's stern voice cut through the tension. You'll apologize to everyone involved, including Sandra and Paulo, and you'll face the consequences of your actions. There's no escaping this. Lila nodded, her shame evident. I'll do whatever it takes to make amends. With Lila's confession behind them, the Santos family began the slow process of healing. However, forgiveness didn't come easily. Sandra stayed up late one night, staring out her bedroom window. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on her chest. She felt a mix of relief that the truth had come out and guilt for the pain it had caused. A soft knock on her door startled her. Come in, she said. Charmaine entered, her expression unreadable. Sandra braced herself for another confrontation, but instead, her sister sat down beside her. I've been thinking, Charmaine began, her voice soft. About everything. About you, Paulo, and Lila. Sandra swallowed hard. Charmaine, I'm so sorry. Charmaine held up a hand. Let me finish, she said. I was angry at you, at Paulo, at the world, but after hearing what Lila did, I realized you were just as much a victim as I was. Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. 8. I would never do that on purpose. Charmaine nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears. I know, and I'm not ready to forgive everything just yet, but I don't want to lose my sister either. Sandra hugged her tightly, sobbing into her shoulder. Thank you, 8. Thank you for giving me another chance. The next day, Paulo visited the Santos household to formally apologize to the family. He knelt before Delphin and Divina, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. I take full responsibility for my actions, Paulo said. I should have been more cautious, more aware. I let my guard down, and it caused so much pain. I'm deeply sorry. Delphin nodded solemnly. It takes courage to admit your mistakes, Paulo, but words are only the beginning. Show us through your actions that you mean what you say. Paulo promised to rebuild the trust he had lost, not just with the family but with Sandra as well. The days after Lila's confession were heavy with tension. The Santos household seemed quieter, each family member retreating into their thoughts. Despite the revelation of the truth, the scars left by betrayal and heartbreak were still fresh. Sandra spent most of her time in her room, avoiding eye contact with her parents and Charmaine. She busied herself with menial tasks, hoping to distract her mind from the whirlwind of emotions. However, nothing could stop the guilt from gnawing at her heart. One evening, Delphin called for a family dinner, determined to reestablish some semblance of normalcy. Sandra hesitated at first, but eventually joined the table, where an uneasy silence hung in the air. Charmaine, sitting across from Sandra, broke the silence. I've decided to leave the city for a while, she announced. Sandra's fork clattered against her plate. Leave? Why? Charmaine's gaze softened, but her voice carried a resolute tone. I need time to heal, Sandra. I can't stay here and pretend everything is fine when it's not. Divina, who had been silently fuming since the dinner began, finally spoke. You're running away, Charmaine? No, Mama, Charmaine replied firmly. I'm giving myself space to breathe. Staying here will only remind me of everything that happened. Sandra's chest tightened. 8. I'm sorry. I know, Charmaine interrupted. You've said it many times, and I believe you. But forgiveness takes time. I need this for myself, Sandra. Delphin, ever the peacemaker, nodded in agreement. Sometimes distance is necessary to find clarity. Do what you need to, Charmaine. The rest of the dinner was consumed in silence, each family member lost in their thoughts. Meanwhile, Paulo was working on his own path to redemption. He knew the only way to make things right was to prove his sincerity through actions, not just words. He reached out to Charmaine first, requesting to meet her before she left the city. Charmaine reluctantly agreed, meeting him at a quiet cafe. I know I'm the last person you want to see, Paulo began, his voice steady but filled with regret. But I couldn't let you leave without saying this. Charmaine crossed her arms, her expression guarded. What is it, Paulo? Paulo took a deep breath. I'm sorry for everything. I never wanted to hurt you, and I'll regret what happened for the rest of my life. You didn't deserve any of this. Charmaine's lips pressed into a thin line. You're right. I didn't deserve this, but you weren't the only one at fault. Paulo nodded, his gaze unwavering. I know. That's why I'm here. Not to make excuses, but to take responsibility. I want you to know that I'm committed to making amends, not just for you but for Sandra as well. Charmaine's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your words, Paulo, but words won't erase the pain. I hope, for Sandra's sake, that you mean what you say. After their meeting, Paulo dedicated himself to helping Sandra rebuild her life. He started by spending time with her family, assisting Delphin with household repairs, and making an effort to connect with Divina, who remained skeptical of his intentions. Charmaine's departure marked a turning point for the Santos family. While her absence was deeply felt, it also allowed the remaining members to focus on rebuilding their fractured relationships. Sandra approached her mother one morning as she prepared breakfast. "Mama, can I help?" she asked tentatively. Divina looked at her daughter, her expression unreadable. "Do you think helping me in the kitchen will make up for everything?" Sandra's shoulders sagged. "No, Ma, but I want to try. I want to show you that I'm not the person you think I am." Divina sighed, her stern expression softening slightly. "Actions speak louder than words, Sandra. If you truly want to earn back my trust, it will take more than just apologies." Sandra nodded. "I understand, Ma, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." As days turned into weeks, Sandra and Divina worked side by side in the kitchen, slowly bridging the gap between them. While their relationship wasn't fully healed, it was a start. One evening, Paulo joined Sandra and her parents for dinner. The atmosphere was tense, but Delphin made an effort to include Paulo in the conversation. "So, Paulo," Delphin began, "what are your plans now?" Paulo straightened in his seat. "I'm planning to expand my business, sir. But more importantly, I want to focus on building trust with Sandra and the family." Divina raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Paulo met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "By being consistent. By showing you all that I'm here for the long haul. I won't run away from my mistakes." Delphin nodded approvingly. "Good. Words are easy, but actions take commitment." After dinner, Paulo and Sandra sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paulo took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't know, Sandra, but I'm willing to fight for us. Are you?" Sandra looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. "Yes," she said softly, "I am." Sandra's efforts to mend her relationships with her family began to bear fruit, though the road was still steep and filled with obstacles. Divina remained distant, her sharp words a constant reminder of the pain caused. However, Delphin's quiet encouragement gave Sandra hope, urging her to keep moving forward. One afternoon, while Sandra was cleaning the living room, she found an old photo album tucked away in the bottom drawer of a cabinet. Curiosity piqued, she flipped through the pages. Images of her parents in their youth, her and Charmaine as children, and old family gatherings filled the pages. Her hands froze on a photo of a younger Divina, standing beside a man who wasn't Delphin. The man had an arm casually draped over Divina's shoulder, a charming smile on his face. Sandra frowned. "Who's this?" she murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the photo. Before she could dwell on it, Divina's voice rang out. "Sandra, what are you doing?" Sandra jumped and quickly closed the album. "I was just cleaning and found this, Mama. Divina's eyes landed on the album, and her expression hardened. "Leave that alone. It's none of your business," she said, snatching it from Sandra's hands. Sandra hesitated. "Mama, who was that man? Was he—" "Enough," Divina snapped, her voice trembling. "Go finish your work." Sandra's heart sank as she watched her mother storm off with the album. The tension in Divina's voice and the haunted look in her eyes left Sandra with more questions than answers. Paulo's resolve to rebuild trust with the Santos family continued. He spent his days balancing work and his efforts to prove his sincerity. He frequently visited Delphin, offering help around the house and even accompanying him on errands. One evening, Paulo approached Delphin while they were working on fixing a loose fence in the backyard. "Sir Delphin," Paulo began cautiously, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to prove myself." Delphin wiped sweat from his brow and looked at Paulo thoughtfully. "It's not me you need to convince, Paulo. It's Divina and Charmaine." Paulo nodded. "I know, sir, but I also know how important your blessing is to Sandra. She looks up to you." Delphin sighed, setting down his tools. "Sandra is a good girl, but she's been through a lot. If you're serious about her, you need to be patient. Proving your worth isn't just about grand gestures. It's about consistency." "I understand, sir. I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Paulo replied earnestly. Their conversation was interrupted by Divina, who stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "And what exactly do you think you're doing, Paulo?" Paulo stood, meeting her icy gaze. "I'm trying to earn your trust, ma'am Divina." Divina scoffed. "Trust? After what you've done, you think a few kind words and chores will erase the damage you've caused my family?" "No, ma'am," Paulo said firmly. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I love Sandra, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Divina's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, turning and walking back inside. Charmaine's absence was felt deeply by everyone in the Santos household. Sandra missed her sister terribly, despite the strained relationship they had before Charmaine left. She often wrote letters to Charmaine, apologizing and updating her on life at home, though she rarely received a reply. One evening, Sandra was sitting on the porch when Delphin joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thinking about your sister?" Delphin asked, handing her a cup. Sandra nodded. "I miss her, Papa. I wish I could take back everything that happened." Delphin placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past, Anik, but we can learn from it. Your sister will come around, in time. Just keep reaching out to her." As they sipped their coffee in silence, a car pulled into the driveway. Sandra's heart leapt when she saw Charmaine step out, her suitcase in hand. "Eight," Sandra exclaimed, running to hug her sister. Charmaine hesitated before embracing Sandra. "I'm only here for a few days," she said. "Don't get too excited." Sandra nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just glad you're here." Charmaine greeted her parents before heading inside, and the family gathered in the living room. The air was thick with unspoken words, but for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of togetherness. Later that night, Sandra found Charmaine sitting alone on the porch. She hesitated before joining her. "Hey, thank you for coming back," Sandra said softly. Charmaine sighed. "I came back because I realized that running away won't solve anything. We need to face this as a family." Sandra's heart swelled with gratitude. "I'm so sorry for everything, 8. I never meant to hurt you." "I know," Charmaine replied, her voice laced with emotion, "but it's going to take time for me to fully forgive you. I need you to understand that." "I do," Sandra said, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As they sat together under the stars, Sandra felt a glimmer of hope. The road to healing was long, but for the first time, it felt possible. Sandra's curiosity about the mysterious man in the old photograph grew stronger. Divina's evasive reaction only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. She waited until her mother was out running errands and quietly returned to the cabinet where the photo album had been stashed. With trembling hands, she opened the album once more, flipping through the pages until she reached the photo of Divina and the unknown man. Sandra examined the image closely, noting the familiarity in the man's features. His eyes bore a striking resemblance to hers, a realization that sent chills down her spine. "Could this be my real father?" she whispered to herself. Lost in thought, Sandra didn't hear Paulo approach. He gently touched her shoulder, startling her. "Sandra, are you okay?" She quickly closed the album, her heart racing. "I'm fine. I was just cleaning." Paulo frowned but didn't press the issue. "Your mother is still upset with me, but I'm not giving up. I want to talk to her tonight. Maybe if we're honest about our intentions, she'll see that I'm serious about you." Sandra nodded absent-mindedly, her mind still on the photo. "That's a good idea," she murmured. Paulo noticed her distraction but chose not to push. "I'll be here if you need me," he said before leaving her alone. That evening, Sandra confronted her father, Delphin. Holding up the photograph, she asked, "Papa, who is this man?" Delphin's face paled, and he let out a heavy sigh. "Sandra, where did you find that?" "In the cabinet." "Papa, please tell me the truth. Is he my real father?" Delphin hesitated, his silence confirming Sandra's suspicions. His name is Miguel, he finally admitted. He was your mother's first love. When she became pregnant with you, Miguel left without explanation. I loved your mother, so I stepped in to take responsibility and raise you as my own. Tears welled in Sandra's eyes. You've always been my father, Papa. That hasn't changed. But why didn't Mama tell me? She wanted to protect you, Delphin said gently. Divina never fully healed from what Miguel did to her. It's a wound she carries to this day. Sandra's heart ached for her mother. She resolved to confront Divina and demand answers about Miguel. Sandra found Divina in the kitchen the next morning, preparing breakfast. Summoning her courage, she placed the photograph on the counter. Mama, we need to talk about this, Sandra said firmly. Divina froze, her hands tightening around the knife she was holding. She turned slowly to face Sandra, her expression a mixture of anger and pain. Where did you get that? It doesn't matter. I know the truth now, Mama. Miguel is my biological father, isn't he? Divina's eyes filled with tears. Yes, she admitted. Miguel was your father, but he abandoned us, Sandra. He left me when I needed him the most. Why didn't you tell me? Sandra demanded, her voice trembling. I had a right to know. I was trying to protect you, Divina cried. What good would it have done for you to know that the man who gave you life also left you? Sandra shook her head. You don't understand, Mama. Keeping this from me has only made things worse. I need to know who I am. Divina wiped her tears and took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Sandra. I thought I was doing what was best for you. But if you want to know more about Miguel, I won't stop you. Sandra's heart softened at her mother's vulnerability. I just want the truth, Mama. That's all I've ever wanted. That evening, Paulo made good on his promise to talk to Divina. He waited until Delphin had left for an errand and Charmaine was out meeting friends. Paulo approached Divina, who was sitting in the living room, knitting quietly. Ma'am Divina, may I speak with you? Paulo asked politely. Divina looked up, her expression guarded. What is it, Paulo? I know I've hurt your family, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I love Sandra with all my heart, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to her and to you. Divina raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Paulo took a deep breath and knelt before her. I want to ask for Sandra's hand in marriage, but I can't do that without your blessing. Divina's eyes widened in shock. Marriage? After everything that's happened, you think I would agree to that? I understand your hesitation, ma'am, Paulo said earnestly, but I believe that love can heal even the deepest wounds. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Divina stared at him for a long moment before sighing. You're persistent, I'll give you that. But love isn't just about words, Paulo. It's about actions. If you want my blessing, you need to prove that you're worthy of Sandra. I will, Paulo promised. I'll do whatever it takes. Sandra, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, felt her heart swell with emotion. She stepped into the room, tears in her eyes. Paulo, you don't have to do this, she said softly. Yes, I do, Paulo replied, standing and taking her hands in his. Because you're worth it, Sandra. You're worth everything. Divina watched the exchange with a conflicted expression. Though her heart remained guarded, she couldn't deny the sincerity in Paulo's eyes. As the night wore on, Divina began to see a glimmer of hope that perhaps, despite everything, love could indeed find a way to heal the broken pieces of their family. Sandra sat in the quiet confines of her room, the events of the past weeks swirling through her mind. Her heart was heavy with emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and a desperate longing for resolution. The truth about Paulo was still a sore subject, especially with Divina's reluctance to accept him fully. She knew the path to forgiveness would be long and uncertain. As she gazed out the window, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. Sandra? Paulo's voice called softly. Come in, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. Paulo entered, his expression tender but determined. He took a seat beside her, their closeness both comforting and nerve-wracking. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about everything that's happened and everything that could happen." Sandra listened, her heart hanging on every word. "I know I made mistakes," Paulo admitted, "and I regret hurting you and your family. I wish I could turn back time and fix everything, but I can't. What I can do is prove to you, to your family, that I'm more than just my past mistakes. I'm someone who cares deeply, who loves you deeply." Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes as she absorbed his words. "You've already done so much, Paulo. You've shown me who you are, your kindness, your patience." Paulo took her hand gently. "But it's not enough if I don't have your mother's approval. And I understand that. Divina is still hurt. She's scared, just like the rest of us. But we need to face that fear together." Sandra squeezed his hand. "It won't be easy, but I want to try." Later that evening, Divina sat in the living room, quietly reminiscing about the past. Delphin returned home from work and found her deep in thought. He approached cautiously, his concern evident in his eyes. "What's on your mind?" Delphin asked, sitting beside her. Divina gave a heavy sigh. "The same things, Delphin. The past, the present, and what could be if we don't let go of the pain." Delphin reached out and held her hand, offering silent comfort. "It's not easy, I know, but our family has been through worse. We'll get through this too." "Do you believe that?" Divina asked softly. "Do you believe that Paulo can be more than just another mistake?" "I believe that love has a way of surprising us," Delphin said with a faint smile. "Look at Sandra. She's found someone who makes her happy, even if it's complicated. Maybe it's time we learn to trust her judgment." Divina looked into Delphin's eyes, her walls beginning to crumble. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple, Divina, but it's worth the fight." The next day, Sandra decided to take a step forward. With Paulo's support, she approached Divina with a plan. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. "Ma'am Divina," Sandra began cautiously, standing in front of her mother in the living room. "Paulo and I have decided that the best way to prove ourselves is through action. We've planned a family dinner. Just us, no one else. We want to spend time together, without distractions, and try to rebuild what's broken." Divina looked at her daughter with a softened expression. "You really believe this will work?" "I believe it's a start," Sandra said firmly. "And I believe that, with time, we can find a way to move forward together." Divina took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to Paulo, who stood quietly by Sandra's side. "This isn't easy for me, but I see that your intentions are genuine." Paulo nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Ma'am Divina. I won't let you down." As the evening arrived, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. Delphin was more supportive, while Charmaine remained wary but stayed silent for Sandra's sake. Divina, though still cautious, opened up little by little. The conversations flowed, and the walls slowly began to dissolve. During dessert, Divina raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said softly. Sandra and Paulo shared a knowing glance, their hearts filling with hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path toward healing and acceptance. "Cheers," Delphin said, clinking his glass with Divina's. "Cheers," Charmaine added with a hint of a smile. The house grew quieter after dinner, but a sense of peace lingered in the air, a rare, yet cherished moment of understanding. Sandra felt a sense of relief as Paulo held her hand tightly, their love now stronger than ever. The road ahead may still be uncertain, but they were ready to face whatever came their way, together. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.